And thank you for coming, and have a very good conference. Thank you. Without further ado, let's listen to Professor Kathleen Graves as our first plenary speaker. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'll go ahead and get started. First, I am just delighted to be here. I lived in Brazil with my family in 1995, and so I became familiar with Lusophone culture and language at that time. And so it's always been a real interest and dream of mine to be able to come to Portugal, which is, of course, what gave birth to Brazil and Brazilian Portuguese. I did learn right away that I had to make a lot of adjustments in the way the language is spoken. I'm not very fluent in Portuguese, but it's been fun to try to listen to some of the differences. And, once you're a language teacher, you're always thinking about language. So I would also like to thank APPI for inviting me to come here and giving me this opportunity, and also the U.S. State Department and the American Embassy for sponsoring me. And yes, it was unexpected to be grilled by my ambassador yesterday about the role of English in the world, but it was very interesting for me to talk to him. So I was glad to have that opportunity as well. So I became interested in creativity when I was asked to write a chapter on creativity for a book on creativity in language teaching. I realized, I wrote an abstract, as one does, that made sense, but I realized when I actually sat down to write the chapter that creativity was something that I took for granted but had never really thought about. So for years, I wrote recommendations for teachers that I had worked with and said, this is a very resourceful and creative teacher. But I realized in thinking, well, what did I really mean by saying that this teacher is creative? So in this talk, I will take you on the journey of what I have learned about creativity in teaching, and more specifically, because of course that's my area, about creativity and curriculum. I should say at the outset that this is a vast topic. If you had another speaker come and talk about creativity, they would have probably a completely different angle on it. So there are very many ways of approaching and understanding it, and I will be approaching it in a very specific way in terms of creativity in the language curriculum. I should also say that this is a journey in progress. I will show you a cover of the book. It's coming out in the summer, and I'm very interested in reading the other chapters about creativity. But for me, this is a journey in progress in looking at creativity, and so I welcome you to give me suggestions throughout the conference to make the path clearer. Sir Ken Robinson gave a very famous TED Talk on how schools kill creativity. I see some nods in the audience. And his feeling that creativity now is as important in education as literacy. So one definition that has been attributed to him is that creativity is putting the imagination to work. He sees the human imagination as a gift and one that we need to use wisely. So I'd like to work with that definition of creativity as putting the imagination to work by asking you to try something And this actually came from the editor of the book on creativity. One of the editors is Jack Richards, whom I'm sure many of you, whose work you know. And he used this example in a little bit different way from the way I'm going to use it. So we're taking this, creativity is putting the imagination to work. So imagine that you are going to teach a 50-minute spoken English class, lower intermediate level, and your only teaching aid is an empty glass. I stole this from the hotel room, but I will bring it back. And you only have 5 minutes to prepare. So what are some things you could do in the lesson using the empty glass? So I'd like you to take a moment and just brainstorm ideas with a colleague or on your own, okay? Give you a minute or so to think about this. Okay, I'm going to stop you. This was just to sort of, I am going to ask you to do a few more things, and I'm very happy to see that you're an audience that is willing to do things, asked to do things. This time I won't ask you to contribute, but your ideas, and I'm sure that we have many in the audience. But what I'd like to know is how many of you found that actually difficult to do, to think of what to do. I see a nod there, so show of hands or nods. How many of you found that difficult? Yeah, I certainly would find it difficult. Okay, how many of you found it easy to do? Okay, so we have that, and then I would say probably for others it was somewhere in between. So we could say that this activity is an example of being creative by putting your imagination to work. You had to use your imagination to generate ways to use the empty glass as a teaching material. But is it enough? I don't think it's the best use of imagination because it's isolated with no real purpose. It's kind of like gymnastics for the brain. If I'm going to put my imagination to work, I want to think about why, for what purpose, for what gain. I would say that defining creativity as putting your imagination to work is a good start, but it's not a sufficient definition. In my exploration of creativity for the chapter that I wrote, I came across the writing of Margaret Bowden. Margaret Bowden is an English philosopher and computational psychologist, and she defines creativity as the ability to come up with ideas that are new, surprising, and valuable. So by ideas, she means anything from a scientific theory to a style of painting, a recipe, or a way of building a bridge. Ken Robinson had a similar definition in his TED Talk. He called it the process of having original ideas that have value. So we now have 3 new ingredients for creativity. Creativity is putting your imagination to work to come up with ideas that are new, surprising, and valuable. But for me, this definition raised the question, who decides that an idea has value, is new, or is surprising? I'm not a scientist, so I cannot judge whether a scientific theory is original or of value, but other scientists can. Similarly, a scientist who can judge the value of a scientific theory is not necessarily able to judge the originality of a new way of making a cake, but a baker can. The point here is that creativity is something that occurs in relation to a domain of thinking, a domain of activity. So, what are some domains of thinking or activity? Jazz, mechanical engineering, pastry making, chess, molecular theory, portrait painting, language curriculum. These are all domains of thinking. So we can now add within a domain of thinking or activity to our definition. So how does a domain work? Each of these domains is defined by a set of organizing principles or parameters. So, if we think of the domain of chess, for example, what makes it chess and not some other game? The organizing principles or parameters are two opponents, the particular pieces, queen, pawn, bishop, their positions, the particular moves the players can make with a particular piece. I don't know, how many of you play chess? Okay. I once had a German boyfriend who tried to teach me, and it almost ruined our relationship. But anyway, but I think it's a good example. You can find lots of images, and it really shows you. So these elements I just mentioned make up the organizing principles or parameters of chess. They structure the way chess is played, and they define the possibilities within it. So, as you know, I'm not a chess player, but I know that there are an incalculable number of possibilities for chess moves within any one game. So let's take the domain of jazz. Margaret Bowden says that the parameters that define jazz are governing melody, tempo, and harmony. She calls these parameters constraints. So I use the word parameter because constraint has a kind of a negative idea, but still it's an important concept. She makes the point that we need these constraints in order to have music. So here's something that she wrote. She says, it's these constraints, governing harmony, melody, and tempo, that make the jazz performance possible in the first place. Without them, we would have a mere random cacophony. So, the parameters of jazz both define the boundaries of the domain and offer possibilities within it. So we can now expand our definition of creativity. Whoops. So it's putting the imagination to work to generate ideas that are original and valuable within a domain of thinking, which is defined by parameters that both set its boundaries and offer possibilities within them. This made sense to me, as I remember conversations with colleagues about how, as teachers, it helps to have some kind of boundaries within which to be creative. But this didn't explain how we have ideas that are new, surprising, and valuable, or why we have them. What motivates creativity? What makes us want to be creative? So let's try an experiment. We're going to consider the domain of portrait painting. Now, I'm not an artist or an art historian, so this is definitely an amateur's attempt, but I hope it will illustrate where I'm going with creativity. What might be some organizing principles or parameters of portrait painting? So, these are some of the things that I thought about as an artist. You know, what are some of the features of portrait painting that you need to take into account? I would say that we need a human subject. In this case, you know, the subject is a person. And at a minimum, we need a face, right? Another parameter is perspective. When I was reading up on this to prepare for this, it is really how are you positioning the person in the portrait? That has an effect on it. Another might be how the person is being portrayed. Are they being portrayed in a realistic or in an idealistic way? And it's fascinating now if you go and start looking at portraits and seeing what was behind the artist's, what was in the artist's mind and how they wanted to present this person. Another, obviously, is color palette. What ranges of colors will you use? So these are some of the possible parameters in which there are many, many possibilities. So this is our experiment. I'd like you to take a look at these two paintings. So the one on the left was painted in the 14th century, and the one on the right, on your right, was painted in the 15th. What I'd like you to do is to take a minute to identify the differences that you see between the earlier painting, the one on the left, and the later painting on the right. So you're looking for what you see as the differences. And could I ask you to just briefly discuss these differences with a colleague? Okay, I'm going to stop you for a moment, and I'd like to just get some ideas about some of the differences that you saw between the two paintings. So could I have some volunteers? I know it's always hard in a large group for people to volunteer, but it's very helpful because I can kind of play off of some of what you say. What are some of the differences that you identified between the two? And I know that we're language teachers, not art historians. Yes? Oh. Okay. Okay. Okay, so this person, you have the feeling is, it's more of a real person, and that she's looking outside of the picture, where this one seems more, less realistic? Yeah, okay, yeah. What are some other differences that you noticed between yes? And by the way, I do have to confess that as I get older, I get harder of hearing. So if you don't mind speaking loudly so that we can hear.
Well, for me, the picture on the left is really flat, like two-dimensional. And the picture on the right has perspective, depth, and looks realistic also because of that.
Right, okay. So this is a much flatter portrait on the right. This has perspective. Again, you have much more texture and more feeling of a person in the painting. Okay, yes. Oh, you didn't have your hand. Okay, I'm gonna. Yes, one more. Right. Okay. So I'll confess right away. Yes. So that this is in fact a picture of the Virgin Mary. I had a hard time finding very early portraits of women. They were all much later. So I did. So in effect, yes, this is much more seductive. That's not something that we associate with a religious painting. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Those are all great. Yes. One more. Okay, hold on for the similarities, okay? So now I have another task for you, and this is where we're looking at exploring the idea of creativity. I want you to imagine that you are the artist in the painting on your right, okay? And you became an artist at a time when the kinds of portraits that were prevalent were the ones like the painting on the left. But you were a rebel. You rebelled against this kind of painting. You wanted to paint something different. So you painted the portrait on the right. What are some ways that you wanted your portrait to be different from the portrait on the left? So I want you to consider the differences that you identified between the paintings and imagine that you are you're the artist of that second portrait, and you're trying to explain what you want to achieve in the portrait. So, for example, as one of you mentioned, we could say that this is a much more idealized portrait, and you wanted to portray more the reality of the person. So, would you please, again, discuss with a colleague what you might say as the artist? This is what I'm trying to do. Okay, I'm gonna stop you again. When you have a group, you get. So what's something that you might say as this artist, and then I'll tell you later who you are if you haven't already recognized the portrait. What is something that you might say? This is what I want to do in my painting.
I want to involve the viewer.
Okay, I want to.
To feel that there's someone looking straight at them.
Okay, I want to involve the viewer. I want to feel that it's someone looking straight at them, okay? And this artist was definitely interested in the psychology of people. Okay, one other idea.
I want to be different.
Okay. I want to be different, but the point of this is that there are very specific differences that this artist is trying to achieve. So what is it? It's not just to be different for different's sake. What's that?
Attractive.
Okay. Okay, that... Say that again? Okay, humanizing. Okay, this is definitely... Okay, the idea of humanizing, becoming less ideal. Yes, one more? Light. Okay, so great ideas. So here's some of the things that I might say if I were the artist. I wanted to paint in a realistic way, not in an idealized way. The old way is flat. It doesn't show a person's inner life. I wanted to show that this woman has emotion to portray her psychological reality. I wanted to use light and shade to convey the mystery of this woman, and I wanted to have her eyes gaze at and also just beyond the viewer. So these are just some possible differences. Here's another painting, and I'll tell you right now. So this is Giotto, and you've just been Leonardo da Vinci, okay? So here's another painting. And this one was painted in the 1800s. So some differences from the previous paintings are the lightness of the painting and the color palette and the setting for the subject. The artist might say that he wanted to create more lightness in the painting, so he used quicker brush strokes and a different color palette to create more natural light. He may have wanted to show this woman's connection with her surroundings, so he painted her in her home with her furniture visible. So these are just some ideas that, as I was playing with this. So what these artists have done is to explore possibilities for different ways to do things within the domain of portrait painting. We could say that they identified limitations that they wanted to change, such as the flatness of the face in the first painting, or that they discovered new possibilities for ways of doing things, such as painting with quick, feathery brushstrokes in the third painting. So what they were doing is engaging in what Margaret Bowden calls exploratory creativity. If we think of a domain as a conceptual space, then exploratory creativity means exploring that conceptual space. It involves discovering or uncovering aspects that weren't noticed before, or coming up against limitations of the space and then pointing to areas of possible change. So we all engage in exploratory creativity when we identify limitations or gaps that we want to change and when we find new ways of doing things. And we will explore what this means for language teaching in a moment. But before we do this, there's one other type of creativity to consider. This is what Margaret Bowden calls transformational creativity. So we've been looking at exploratory creativity. Transformational creativity involves changing the way of thinking in the domain by dropping a parameter or adding one. So remember that exploratory creativity means using our imagination within the parameters that define the domain. In transformational creativity, we add or drop a parameter. So let's look at what this means in terms of portrait painting. So if we look at these three portraits, they bear a resemblance to each other. We can certainly see differences. We can see differences in perspective and in color palette and so on, but there are similarities as well. Now, if we look at this fourth portrait, so I think you can guess who the artist is. It's painted by Picasso. We can see a big difference. This artist has broken the rule of perspective. He has dropped the parameter of portraying the person on one plane from a single perspective. Instead, he has painted her on different planes from several perspectives. So he's opened up a whole new approach to painting a portrait. So transformational creativity changes our way of understanding or experiencing a domain. And Margaret Bowden says that the resulting change is so marked that the new idea may be difficult to accept or even understand. And I can tell you that, and I'm sure you know, many people were horrified by Cubism and the types of portraits, and they did not consider them to be art. They have since influenced generations of artists, but at the time, there was a real reaction against this. So what does this have to do with language teaching and language curriculum? Let's recap what I've talked about so far. So creativity is using your imagination, putting it to work to come up with new, surprising, and valuable ideas within a domain of thinking or activity. So I've tried to use this circle as portraying the domain, and then the ribs in the circle are the different parameters. So in exploratory creativity, we explore the domain to discover new possibilities or to identify limitations. But in transformational creativity, we either add a parameter or we drop one, and therefore we completely transform it and change it. So let's apply these ideas to language curriculum as a domain of thinking. A language curriculum is defined by parameters that both set the boundaries and offer possibilities. So we have to say, what are the parameters of a language curriculum? And then in terms of exploratory creativity, how can we engage in exploratory creativity? So what are some of the gaps or limitations that we want to overcome, and what new possibilities can we explore? What would be considered transformational in a language curriculum? What parameters could be added or dropped to transform it? Now, I've been interested in curriculum for a long time, largely because I want to dispel the notion that a curriculum is something that experts produce and the teachers are simply its recipients and implementers. Curriculum is not something that is separate from the classroom. The success of a curriculum plan can only be judged by how it supports and guides learning. So it was very interesting for me to consider how curriculum is a domain of thinking, that it's a kind of conceptual space, and also to think about, well, what are the organizing principles and parameters? So I actually have based the parameters that I'm going to explain on something that I read about designing technology. Because in technology, designers have to consider the users, or else their technology won't be successful. So I would say that the parameters of curriculum are the following. The first is conceptual understandings. Whoops. These are the conceptual understandings that underlie the curriculum. By this I mean, for us, what is the view of language that underlies the curriculum? What is the view of how language is learned? And how will these views shape decisions about what and how students will learn? The second parameter is context. Who is the curriculum for? Who are the students? Why are they studying? Where are they studying? Who's the teacher? What kind of resources are there? What role does the community play? For a curriculum to be successful, it must take into account these questions about context. And I've just written another chapter on curriculum for a handbook and looked at mismatches that basically make, what are the basic mismatches that make curriculums not succeed, and not taking the context into account is one of the biggest factors. The third parameter is are the curriculum guidelines and materials, okay? Timetables, syllabus, and in fact, this is often what we think of as the curriculum. But in fact, these are tools that guide and shape the path of learning. So one of the questions we have to ask for a curriculum are, what are the guidelines? How will they be communicated? What kinds of materials will be used? What topics will be covered in what order? The fourth parameter is classroom interactions and learning activities. And this, I mean, what actually happens in the classroom? How will teachers and learners use the materials, use the guidelines, create materials, and so on? Excuse me. The fifth parameter is assessment. And by this I mean, what will be assessed? Really what we're saying is, what counts as learning? How will we know what students have learned? So these 5 parameters shape the way we design and enact curriculum. So now I'm going to just show some images of classrooms, because really I want us to be thinking that this is where curriculum happens. So these are images of language classrooms from all over the world, and I'm going to focus on the one in the upper right-hand corner, because that's one from Spain, and we're going to look at it a little bit in detail. So this is the classroom. Just kind of notice, it should be one that looks fairly familiar. We know immediately that it's a language classroom. So I'm going to talk through the parameters using this classroom. So we're going to say, what is the context? So if we look there, we know that they're primary school students. We say, well, it looks like they're studying grammar, because on the bulletin in the back, we can see the WH question words and the question chart. In the way back, there are also reports by children of travel that they did. So we can't say too much about the context because we're not there and we don't know the people, but we do have an idea. It's one that's familiar to us. What about the views of language and language learning? So again, just based on the image, we can speculate that it might involve grammar, that language is viewed as having patterns if we're looking at on the conceptual level. It involves the 4 skills. They've done some writing. So they might be gathering some information. The guidelines and materials that outline what the students are learning, what are those? We can see different kinds of materials, certainly some on the bulletin board. And interestingly, of course, they all have a text in front of them. But we can't really say, just looking at it, what are the curriculum guidelines? What about the classroom interaction and learning activities? So we see that the students have their arm raised, presumably to answer a question the teacher has posed. So we know that there's some teacher-directed student interaction. They're seated next to each other, so we could conjecture that they can do small pair work or even small group work. The desks are movable, which is very nice for that kind of work. The travel report suggests that there's individual work and that it's personalized. Now, what about assessment? Again, we can't tell from the picture, but certainly seeing who, what, where, when, how, why, there maybe is a grammar component. So, I'm just using this to remind us that a curriculum has a context, conceptual underpinnings, curriculum guidelines and materials, people who use them in certain ways in the classroom, and assessment. So how can we be creative within these parameters? These parameters set the boundaries for the possibilities, and also they define the range of possibilities. And there's a huge range of possibilities. Think of it, there are many kinds of contexts, different ways to view language and language learning, different kinds of materials, different kinds of learning activities, different kinds of assessment. But they aren't random. They all fit together in ways that make sense. So in order to be creative within a curriculum, we need to explore these parameters and identify the limitations and the things that we want to change. And that way we can discover new possibilities and new ways of thinking and doing things. Within each of these parameters, we can put our imagination to work. So I'm going to actually now involve you a little bit in exploring parameters. And we're going to look at a textbook, and we're going to imagine, now it's not, but you see a textbook on their desk. We're going to look at a textbook page, and we're going to imagine that this is the textbook that they're using. So just take just a minute to sort of familiarize yourself with what's up there. Okay, so if you look at this, can you see it clearly enough? It was instead of having a handout. So these are kids about the same age. They're 11 to 12-year-olds. I observed classes in Bahrain, and this is where it was being used. So they have English 45 minutes a day. And what was really interesting to me is to look at a little bit what some of the conceptual understanding that the curriculum is based on. So if we look at these two pages, we can see that the theme is the origin of foods around the world. We see 3 illustrations of food, each from a different region. Each has a few sentences that explain which kinds of food came from the region. So there's also a map, and there are 2 pair activities, one to practice vocabulary, and there are, the other to ask yes/no questions. So if we looked at this and said, what is the view of language? I think we would say that language is seen as vocabulary. We see lexical sets of food. It's a grammatical system. We see grammar structures. Are there any? There is, yes/no questions. It's mainly presented at the sentence level. And it's used, and the sentences are used to introduce the vocabulary. What's the view of language learning? It seems to be a kind of input-output view. So learners listen and read in order to link words and images and learn the vocabulary. It involves practice of the grammar structure. Language that is learned is really a rehearsal for later use outside of the classroom. So they're expected to take in this vocabulary and do some form of output in some of these activities. What types of interactions? Just suggested from the material. I'm not saying this is actually how the teacher used the materials. So if you look at the verbs, they listen, they look, they read, they point, they ask and answer, So they do pair work. And it appears to be communicative, but really it's designed to practice there is, there are, there aren't any, and so on. They get input that they turn into output, and I would say that the interactions are pretty scripted. So there isn't much going on in the way of problem solving, or natural language use. It's possible that the teacher has a central role explaining and so on. And as far as assessment or what counts as learning, it seems to be retrieval of vocabulary and correct use of grammar. So what I've tried to do here is just, again, outline these parameters of curriculum as they're made manifest in the materials. Because in order to be creative, we need to understand the boundaries of the domain so that we can explore ways to change it. Once we have identified the boundaries, we can then use our imagination to look at what the possibilities are and explore ways to overcome the limitations. So it's like the portrait painter who identifies what he wants to change and explore within the givens of the domain. So now I'm going to try an experiment in exploratory creativity with you. The first thing I'd like you to do is to identify what you see as the limitations of these materials. What are some limitations in terms of the view of language and of language learning? What are some limitations in the types of interactions and learning activities? And also, if you would like, what are some limitations of assessment or what counts as learning? Because if we want to be creative, we need to identify what those limitations are. So imagine that you're a teacher, okay, my glass now has water in it, but a little bit different from the empty glass. You're a teacher, you have been, this is the textbook that you use with these 11-year-old learners, and you want to use exploratory creativity, so you have to say, okay, what are the limitations? So I'm put that up there. Whoops. Yes, this is what I want you to discuss with a colleague, and then we'll put this. So I put it up there, and I think the page is still. So could you take a moment, identify what some of these limitations are that we want to be creative around? Okay, is that enough time just to get us started? Okay, and here again, I would like to ask you to say, what do you see? So you're the teacher, you're defining the limitations, looking for possibilities. What are some of the limitations that you see in this particular material? Think of yourself as a portrait painter. You are going to paint a new portrait. What is it that you would change? Yes. Oh, Annie, thank you.
We were talking about this here, and we think it's very static. I mean, what counts as learning is that the students are able to produce yes/no questions correctly using a finite set of words. So there is no creativity expected of the students. It's like it could be a component of geography. It could be.
Right.
Because there's a map there. So you would be able to the teacher to decide if you wanted to explore it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So what's being pointed out is that It's very static in the sense that it's the language on the page that is the language that they use, so going back to that. And they don't really move off of the page, at least as it's constructed right now. So that is, it's limited in that way. Okay, thank you. What's another limitation that you perceive? Yes? Right. Yeah. Okay, so there's really, in a way, there's no student on the page. I mean, they have pictures of students, but it doesn't bring the students' lives, their knowledge, their interest is not built into this. So this is something. Okay, thank you. And I'm sure you identified other limitations, and that's, part of our work as teachers. So I'm going to ask you to take one limitation. So that's our first step in exploratory creativity, is identifying limitations. And that's actually quite important to be clear about what the limitations are. So I will take one. And I would say that one limitation is that the learners are restricted in their interactions. They don't have opportunities for problem solving or for natural language use. It's a very scripted kind of activity and language output that they have. So what I would like you to do in the exploration, and I'll put the page back up, is to think about how can we use this material but give learners more responsibility, more opportunities for problem solving and natural language use. Okay, so just take a moment. How would we do that? And let me put that, there we go. Oh, thank you. Oh. Okay, I know it's not enough time for you to truly be creative, but I have two screens here. One shows me my slide, I should be paying attention to it, and the other shows me the time that's ticking away. So, if I could just ask you, what are some ideas that you had for ways that you could use this material but give the students more opportunities for problem solving, natural language use, and so on? Ideas in the, yes? Okay. Okay, so two things that you mentioned. One is a classifying activity, looking at the different kinds of fruits and vegetables or foods that are there. And then another is more bringing in the learners. What are the foods that they like and they dislike? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so getting them thinking about going to these different countries and what are the kinds of things they would eat. Okay. Sorry? Okay, tastes and flavors. Yeah, we could bring in the 5 senses. Yeah, okay, yeah. So, thinking about the problem solving, the idea of creating a chart where the fruits and vegetables come from. They could create their own basket and put the fruits and vegetables and other foods that they like and so on. So there's actually the material, once we identify some of the boundaries, we can start to think about, yes, there are things that we can use these materials for and overcome these limitations that we see in them. So what we're doing in this case is engaging in exploratory creativity. This is something that we do naturally as human beings and as teachers, and our motivation for creativity arises from the possibilities and challenges inherent in the complexity of learning a language in the classroom. In this case, we've looked at the limitations in the materials and corresponding limitations in other parameters of the curriculum. There may also be particular challenges of a context that inhibit student learning, such as time constraints, class size, and low student motivation. So I think, a lot of these, what has become clear to me is that the only way that we can be creative is, sorry, I should never say anything's the only way. One of the things that helps us to be creative is to be very clear about what some of the challenges or the boundaries are. And in other ways, I've called this problematizing, thinking about that. So this is different from the empty glass experience. In that activity, there were no boundaries. We didn't know what the limitations were, and we didn't know what we were supposed to address. So by not knowing what the limitations are, it's difficult to know what the possibilities are that we want to explore. So in a sense, then, we need boundaries within which to be creative. So thus far, I've been talking about exploratory creativity. What about the second type of creativity, transformational creativity? Have any of you been wondering, well, what does that look like in the language curriculum? So I'd like you here to take a moment and read this quote from a primary school teacher in Italy. Okay, would you say that this is a teacher who has been exploring creative ways to use a textbook the way we've been doing? Let's actually look at some key words that suggest that this may not be the case. So we have real-world task, cooperate with peers, using the language for concrete purposes, and use authentic resources. So what this teacher is teaching is a unit on healthy eating in an Italian primary class. The materials the students are using is this graphic. It's a food pyramid that shows the kinds of foods and proportions for each day for a healthy diet. The unit would normally be taught in Italian, but instead is being taught in English. The students learn how to gather information on the topic. In this case, they use the food pyramid to understand how food can be classified for a healthy diet. The students work cooperatively to interpret and explain what is in the graphic and use it to compare with and evaluate their own diet. So we know this approach under the name of CLEAL, Content and Language Integrated Learning. Within the domain of language curriculum, CLEAL is an example of transformational creativity. Why? Remember that the definition of transformational creativity is that a parameter is added or dropped for the domain. So in the case of portrait painting, the cubists dropped the parameter of a single perspective to create multiple planes and multiple perspectives. In the case of CLEAL, a parameter has been added, and that parameter is content. So by adding content, the whole domain has been transformed. So let's just look quickly at these parameters. So the view of language is, and you're going to see in each of them that we've added the word content. Language is no longer viewed as an end in itself, but it's the means for learning about content. So the learners are not learning lexical sets of food in order to memorize food vocabulary. They're learning to identify foods that fit into different categories, types of vegetables, types of bread, etc. So the language is determined by the content. What is the view of how language is learned? It's no longer viewed as learning discrete language items, practicing grammar patterns, or rehearsing interactions for use outside of the classroom. It's acquired in the process of learning the content, or as one teacher put it, they are using the language as they learn it, and I would add, they are learning the language as they use it. So in this unit, they learn and use the language of food as they learn about how and why it is classified in the pyramid. What are the guidelines and materials? Again, authentic materials related to the content, and of course, if it's not a content class, there are content objectives and language objectives. Types of interactions and activities. So this is much more about the tasks, investigating, problem solving. There's a greater use of cognitive capacities when they have all these kinds of different research to do. What about assessment? What counts as learning? So what counts as learning is no longer mastery of grammar patterns, vocabulary, and dialogues, but how well students understand the content which they use the language to demonstrate. So by adding the parameter of content and fundamentally changing the view of language in the classroom, the domain has been transformed. And so I've just created a table to show what one teacher has called a traditional approach to teaching versus a CLIL approach. And what you'll see to look at this idea of transformational activity is that content has been added, is a parameter that has been added in each of the domains. So, according to Margaret Bowden, oh yes, I have here a note. I haven't mentioned context. And of course, context is a key parameter in the success of a curriculum. And CLIL, we know CLIL works when teachers are supported, the community supports it, the parent supports it, and the school supports it. So in the case of these particular cases in Italy, this was something that was very much supported in the community. According to Margaret Bowden, transformational creativity breaks the commonly accepted rules and challenges other people to adopt new values in accepting the novel idea. And I was interested in how this quote from another Italian teacher kind of mirrored that idea. That she says, my methodology has completely changed because I use CLIL strategies in every situation. Even when I use a textbook, I can't go back to a traditional TEFL way. The important thing about curriculum transformation is that it's not one person who has an aha moment and the curriculum is suddenly transformed. It takes place over time as different teachers and researchers identify limitations and possibilities within the prevailing norm. Picasso didn't invent Cubism. It incubated in the work of many artists over time. Similarly, CLIL has developed over time as different teachers, researchers, educational authorities have considered the limitations of the traditional curriculum and explored possibilities for change. Although we tend to think of creativity as residing in the individual, I think that in education, it is actually a collaborative process. And it's definitely one that benefits from collaboration. And you know, one of the themes sometimes that I've talked about is that as teachers we have great autonomy when we're in the classroom, but we're also isolated. And I think creativity is greatly enhanced when we can work together. So in the title of my talk, I claim that creativity is an essential resource for the 21st century. In today's world, where both children and adults must learn to cope with the many demands of our networked and globalized society, we increasingly depend on problem-solving, adaptive, and collaborative skills. Nurturing creativity in ourselves and in our students plays an important role in helping to develop these skills. So in closing, I'd like to return to the journey metaphor that I used at the beginning of the talk. What have I learned on my journey of exploring creativity in the curriculum? I believe that we all have the capacity and desire to be creative. I think we're naturally motivated as human beings to use our imagination to experiment, to take risks, to try new ways of understanding or doing things. Teaching is fundamentally a human relational activity, and so it is by nature full of possibilities and challenges. What helps us to be creative is to be clear about what the challenges are so that we can direct our imagination in productive ways. It also helps to entertain new possibilities and to try new ways of doing things, even if, or perhaps especially if, the outcomes are not guaranteed and we may fail. Otherwise, we won't learn or change. How many times do we say that to our students? We have to say it also to ourselves. In that respect, creativity is a precious, generative resource. And I'd like to close with some words of Maya Angelou. You can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have. Thank you.